Right, Sean, frustrating indeed, and certainly frustrating at the very least. Thanks so much. Sean Caleb's live at the Jersey Shore. Meanwhile, federal and state governments rushed to put together a bill to rescue Superstorm Sandy victims, but where has that money gone? A $60 billion fund was set aside for Sandy victims, $50 billion for rebuilding efforts, and the rest for flood insurance. But a year later, only 23% of those funds have been assigned, and less than 11% has actually been spent. The Department of Housing and Urban Development got the most funding at over $15 billion. According to Taxpayers for Common Sense, lawmakers didn't give the agency overseeing Sandy spending the power to compel agencies to disclose the information that tracks that spending. And as we just reported, Superstorm Sandy reportedly caused damage in excess of $68 billion. And as we just heard from Sean, over 360,000 structures in New York and New Jersey were destroyed. Many are still struggling to rebuild. And joining us now is Stephen Bowen, Senior Scientist at Aon Benfield Forecasting. Stephen, thanks for joining us tonight.
Thank you for having me.
Stephen, Superstorm Sandy is considered the second costliest hurricane in U.S. history. On the first anniversary of Sandy, where do the current losses stand, both on an economic loss and an insured loss basis?
Well, as you mentioned, Sandy was an enormous storm, as you know, the first anniversary is showing. The overall economic cost, that includes the United States and also parts of the Caribbean, the Bahamas, and also in Canada, given the enormous size of the storm, caused a little bit more than $70 billion. The vast majority was in the United States. The estimates range anywhere from 65 to 68 billion on the economic side. And that does, as you mentioned, that makes it the second costliest, not just in the U.S., but the second costliest global tropical cyclone in history. Now, from the insurance side, the amount of that 72 billion that was covered by insurance was roughly around 30 billion. As the previous segment was talking about 20 to 23 billion of that was covered by private insurers, and the rest was paid out through the U.S. government's National Flood Insurance Program, the NFIP. The last count was about 7.3 billion in payouts from roughly 128,000 claims. Now, what we saw with Katrina, there was a very slow, steady trickle of these additional policies being paid out, and it took several years, unfortunately. And so as we hit the 1-year mark today, you know, it's probably going to take at least another year or two before these payouts are finally completed.
Stephen, do you think that the U.S. needs to create some kind of trust fund dedicated to disaster relief and reconstruction?
It's a difficult question. I mean, it really depends on the area, because with these hurricanes, there's so many dynamics that come into play in terms of the location, because you get different bathymetry all along the coastline. That's essentially the topography of the ocean. You get some areas where there's a deeper drop-off, so you get storm surge that's not quite as significant because there's not much of a buildup. But if you get areas that have a much shallower kind of a basin, like we saw with Sandy, and you combine that with high tide and everything else, you get this gigantic rush of water that comes inland. So in terms of the original question, it's probably a good idea. I think that it would be fairly easy for governments to kind of get on the ground very quickly and try to handle money and get the recovery process started.
All right.
And
how do other countries compare in terms of insurance coverage for natural disasters? Is the level of insurance penetration for natural disasters in the rest of the world equal to, greater than, or less than that of the U.S.?
Yes and no. Basically, Europe is on fairly similar grounds to the United States in terms of the level of coverage. But if you go to, say, South America or Asia or Africa, there is a much lower level of penetration. Specifically, if you look at China, they've had several multi-billion-dollar disasters this year. I mean, with typhoons, floods, even earthquakes, and only a tiny fraction of that has been covered by insurance. Now, this certainly does open up a lot of doors for the insurance industry moving forward, because there's a lot of growth potential. But at this point, the United States and Europe kind of stand alone in terms of the overall level of penetration coverage.
But as you mentioned, we are seeing natural disasters around the globe. Do you think we've been seeing an increase lately in natural global disasters, and therefore are disaster costs increasing globally too?
Well, certainly we have seen the costs increase over time, and the global population, not just in the U.S. but everywhere, we've seen kind of a migration towards the coastline. And when that happens, you have an increased level of exposure. There's more risk, and so when you get these huge disasters like Sandy or Katrina or even Hurricane Andrew, it certainly ups the possibility of the losses being extensive. So. Yes, so basically to answer your question, going forward, I think that especially with the process of climate change and whatever impacts that could happen, where behind that basically is the extremes become more extreme. So the fact that more people are on the coastline, there's more exposure, and there's certainly a much greater possibility of these losses continuing to increase over time.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much, Stephen Bowen, Senior Scientist at Aon Benfield Forecasting.